Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's webinar on reasonable adjustment. Wow, it's the end of November and Christmas is almost upon us. And with that, today is the last webinar for 2022. Having said that, we will be continuing the Trainer and Assessor PD webinars in 2023. So if you've enjoyed the webinars so far, be sure to keep an eye out for the emails about the 2023 webinars because, yeah, we're planning some really good stuff for you guys. A quick one for you, for those of you that haven't joined me before. My name is Alex Schroder. I am the CEO of VETPrep Australia. I'm also a sanction management specialist and a forensic auditor within the vet sector. Guys, I'm not going to go through my entire pedigree. If you really want to know more about me, feel free to hop onto my LinkedIn profile. And yeah, I think my professional pedigree is there on display for anybody who wants to know more. Quick few housekeeping matters. At the end of today's session, we will have a Q&A session. If I don't get to any of your questions, if I don't get to your question, or if you do have any questions at the end of the webinar or after the webinar, please feel free to email your questions to info@complianceinstitute.edu.au, and the ARCP guys will forward your questions on to me, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Guys, quick one, the platform that we use, your certificates of attendance are automatically issued within 48 hours of the end of the webinar. So if you do not receive the certificate of attendance today, please don't worry. There's no need to email ARCP and ask them where it is. However, if you have not received a certificate of attendance by Wednesday morning, then please feel free to reach out to the ARCP team and they'll look after that. On the matter of certificate of attendance, you will only receive a certificate of attendance of this PD session if you have signed in on GoToWebinar to attend today's session, and obviously if you are attending today's session. We sometimes find people send emails through to ARCP to say, hey, I sat in with my colleague, they registered for the webinar, I didn't. Can I please have a certificate of attendance? Guys, unless you are actually registered for the webinar and unless you've actually actively attended the webinar, ARCP is not able to give you a certificate of attendance, because if you think about it, these professional development webinars count towards your requirements under clause 1.13c of the RTO standards. So unless a person, like I said, has registered and they've actually been active throughout the webinar, ARCP will not be able to give you a certificate of attendance. As I said earlier on, we will be continuing the compliance webinars the VETPD webinars for trainers and assessors in 2023. We will commence again in February of 2023. You know, it's pretty pointless trying to start in January, because we all either still in holiday mode, or we still are on holiday, or we've just come back to work. And the last thing we want to do is dial in for PD webinars, etc. However, as I said, we will recommence in February. And as we've been doing in 2022, we will be doing these webinars for trainer and assessor PDs once a month. Guys, you saw earlier on the RTO validator certification program. At the end of the Q&A session this afternoon, I will spend a few minutes just telling you a bit more about the validator certification program. And there is also potentially funding available for vet practitioners over the age of 40. So if you are interested in either the RTO validator certification program, that's a mouthful, or if you're over 40 and you think you may be interested in funding for doing some accredited learning, feel free to stay in the webinar after the Q&A session, and I'll spend just a few minutes giving you guys more details on those. So without any further ado, today we are looking at reasonable adjustment and specifically what is reasonable adjustment. We're also looking at when reasonable adjustment should or could be applied. We're looking at how reasonable adjustment should be applied, so the assessment process is still compliant. We will also touch on what kind of reasonable adjustment activities would lead potentially to non-compliance. I'll give you guys a few examples of reasonable adjustment or how reasonable adjustment could be implemented. And we'll also briefly touch on how to document when reasonable adjustment has been implemented. So, what is a reasonable adjustment? Guys, I'm not going to read out the statement that I have on the slide. You can read it for yourself. But in a nutshell, reasonable adjustment is something that we apply when somebody either has a disability or that they've got a difficulty of some kind, which could disadvantage their learning and assessment journey. It's generally applied for assessment activities as well as when people are practicing practical activities within the learning sphere. So, to apply reasonable adjustments or RAs, these are generally, like I said, people with learning disabilities. It could be somebody with mental health disabilities or mental health issues, physical disabilities, etc., etc. You could also apply reasonable adjustment to disadvantaged learners. However, I'm going to stress a few times during this webinar that reasonable adjustment is a compliance function and should not be structured by trainers and assessors. So what we often see is trainers and assessors during an assessment activity deciding by themselves to go and apply reasonable adjustment and without the assistance of their compliance team. Guys, when you are going to apply a reasonable adjustment to a learner's learning and assessment journey, there is quite a few things that need to happen in the background. So for argument's sake, when you apply reasonable adjustment to a learner or to a group of learners, the training and assessment strategy needs to be adjusted. Your learning activities need to be adjusted, but specifically the assessment activities need to be adjusted. And implementing reasonable adjustment is not as simple as saying, hey, you know what, this person can't do X, Y, Z. So as the trainer and assessor, I am going to make adjustments to the assessment activities so they can participate. And the reason why it needs to be a compliance function is when you make any kind of adjustment to any assessment activity, you've got to ensure that having made that adjustment, that the assessment instrument that is used, i.e. the adjusted assessment instrument that is used, is still compliant and the outcomes will still meet all of the requirements of the unit of competency as well as the training package. And generally speaking, when reasonable adjustments are made, it quite often and almost always requires assessment activities to be adjusted to obviously be able to address the needs of the person that needs the reasonable adjustment. But as I said, it's literally a restructure of the assessment activities. And unless that is done 100% correctly, you could very well find that a disadvantaged student, be it because of disabilities or other reasons, has undertaken the assessment activities. However, because the assessment activities or the adjusted assessment activities were not structured correctly, that despite them performing the assessment correctly, that they're not compliant and they haven't met all of the requirements of the unit of competency. So once again, please be very, very clear on the fact that as a trainer and assessor, you cannot adjust the assessment tools for any learner that requires training, that requires reasonable adjustment. The adjustment of those assessment tools must be done within your compliance department, because the compliance officer or manager within your RTO must ensure that the adjusted assessment activities still meet the requirements of the unit of competency and or the relevant training package. So, as I said earlier on, we do find that where reasonable adjustments are made to assessment activities, that so often these adjustments result in non-compliant assessment activities. And that is usually due to a lack of planning, due to a lack of documentation, but also because the adjustments themselves have compromised the integrity of the requirements of the training product, i.e. the unit of competency and or the training package requirements. And guys, the easiest and the quickest way for any RTO to get themselves into considerable strife is obviously to have non-compliant assessment tools. So what is the use of an RTO having compliant assessment tools for those assessment tools to then be adjusted and the adjustments to then result in a non-compliance? It just doesn't make sense. So examples of reasonable adjustments. Can I just have 1 second for a bit of a dry throat? I'm so sorry. So examples of reasonable adjustments. You may have a student that goes and breaks their hand or their arm and comes into the assessment process with their hand or their arm in a limb, not in a limb, in a cast. And therefore, they actually cannot go and provide or cannot do a written assessment. In that case, the RTO may decide to use a scribe instead. Now, using a scribe, and people would say, hey, you know, that's very simple. Somebody else is simply doing the writing for the student that is unable to do that. But guys, using a scribe, there is certain documentation that needs to go into the student's file around why a scribe is used, around first of all, around what caused the need for a reasonable adjustment, how the reasonable adjustment was addressed. And if a scribe is used, then the process that was followed as the scribe was scribing the person's work. Now, one of the things that people don't often remember is if somebody is, or if you are using a scribe for a learner who can't physically go and do a written assessment, that scribe needs to go and write word for word what that learner's assessment answer is. They cannot go and they've got to write it, like I said, word for word, grammatically as it's spoken, etc. So if the learner starts giving an incorrect answer, the scribe can, for argument's sake, not turn around and guide them in the direction of the correct answer, because at the end of the day, if somebody is scribing for somebody who is unable to do the written assessment themselves, they need to, like I said, write everything down word for word as the learner is speaking. One of the things that we often suggest is that if there is the use of a scribe because a learner cannot complete the written activities themselves, that the learner's answers are not only written down by the scribe, but it's also recorded on a smartphone. So there's always backup evidence that what has been scribed on behalf of the learner was word for word their own answer. It's also very possible for an assessor to do a verbal assessment in place of written assessments. However, if you are doing a verbal assessment in place of a written assessment, even the verbal assessment tool needs to be specifically structured for that purpose. And what we also so often find is that when a trainer and assessor is doing a verbal assessment instead of a written assessment, that they don't actually record the learner's answers as the answers are given. Furthermore, when verbal assessments are done in place of written assessments, it is so often very tempting for the assessor to, if they find that the learner is going down the wrong road, with their answer to try and guide them towards the correct answer. And guys, we can't do that. You know, if you are doing a verbal assessment versus, or whether you are doing a verbal assessment or a written assessment or even a practical assessment, when the individual has started their assessment process, as assessors or as trainers and assessors, we actually can't give them any assistance whatsoever. It's got to be 100% their own work. Think about back to the rules of assessment and the principles of principles of assessment and rules of evidence. So the rules of evidence very, very clearly state that whatever assessment evidence is presented is the authentic work of that learner. So if we are using a verbal assessment instead of a written assessment because we have a person that can't actually complete the written assessment activity themselves, we need to go and record word for word what they said without any guidance if they are going wrong, because if we do give them guidance if they are going wrong, then the assessment answers will not necessarily be authentically that of the learner, and therefore we don't meet, or they won't meet the rules of evidence. Furthermore, remember the principles of assessment are very, very clear in that the assessor needs to be able to be 100% sure that the work that you are marking is that of that student. So if you are helping somebody with a verbal assessment instead of a written assessment, and you are providing them with guidance as to how to answer the work correctly, you are not able to assert by signing off their assessment that that was their own work, because you've actually helped them with it. Some RTOs, or in some circumstances, you may be able to use audio equipment as a reasonable adjustment, and that obviously is also circumstantial. But what you may also do, you know, I know that in the vet sector, under normal circumstances, we are not allowed to put time limits on how long a learner takes to complete an assessment activity. Having said that, and I also appreciate that in the vet sector, it's all about competence. But having said that, some training packages and some unit of competencies do specify that an assessment activity must be completed within a certain time frame. And we do have a learner that does need a reasonable adjustment, and we do decide, or we allowing them additional time to complete an assessment activity is the answer, or is the most appropriate reasonable adjustment that can be made, then you can do that. However, all reasonable adjustment activities must be properly documented. And once again, when it comes to documenting the reasonable adjustment activities, there's a whole stream of things that are included, such as, and this is something that your compliance team in your RTO would be familiar with, but such as why an RA was needed, evidence of some kind that the request for an RA was actually genuine and authentic, and usually that's a medical certificate. The process that was gone through, like I said, it's a TAS, it's a whole lot of documentation that needs to be included. And as trainers and assessors, trust me, it's far easier and safer for you to leave that up to your compliance team to do than for you to go in and try and make the reasonable adjustments yourself, and then only to find that the reasonable adjustments actually led to non-compliances within the assessment tools or the assessment methodologies that were applied. Now, guys, I'm going to now see, let's have a look at the questions and at the questions that we have. I've got a question here from Jill. Jill, you've asked, as an assessor, I also write assessment tools, therefore I should be able to write the reasonable adjustment. Jill, yes, there are trainers and assessors that do write assessment tools, but remember that in an RTO, best practice within an RTO is for assessment tools to be validated before they are implemented. And even though, or any major adjustments made to assessment tools, they should always be validated before implementation. And validation is a compliance function. So therefore, even if you are the person that does make the reasonable adjustments to the assessment process, those reasonable adjustments must be validated and must be approved by your compliance team before they are actually implemented. So guys, I guess what I'm saying is that if you do have a student that will need reasonable adjustment, well, first of all, usually students or usually RTOs know about it beforehand, because on our enrollment forms, we always ask, look, do you have a disability? Is there anything that you will need help with in your learning and assessment journey? Now, if a person comes into the RTO with an existing requirement that will necessitate reasonable adjustment, the RTO has the time to go and make those reasonable adjustments to the assessment tools prior to assessment time. However, if it is a case of if Joe Soap comes the morning of assessment, he broke his hand the day before, and it is a case of, well, he's not going to be able to do the assessment, then it may very well be a case of saying to mate, we actually can't do your assessment now because we need to go or I need to go and discuss with my compliance team how we can best do reasonable adjustment to the assessment activities so that you're not disadvantaged. And guys, once again, what I'm stressing here, I'm so sorry for sounding like a broken record player, is the main thing to remember is that if reasonable adjustment is required, your compliance team needs to go and make those adjustments to the assessment instruments before they are implemented for any student that needs reasonable adjustment. Jill, does that help? Excellent. And Jill, I'm so sorry for giving you this elongated answer for a very short question. I'm a typical compliance person. Why speak in a sentence when I can speak in a paragraph? I do apologize. Suze, you've said our RTO does not validate assessment tools before we use them. Suze, that's a different conversation. And what I suggest is if you want to contact me afterwards, let's have a one-on-one, because that's a brand new Pandora's box that you are opening there. Sumit, you've asked, is it okay for a trainer and assessor to make a reasonable adjustment and get it approved from compliance team with proper documentation? Sumit, yes, as long as that sign off by the compliance team is done before the reasonable adjustment is actually implemented. So please, under no circumstance is it okay for you to go and first implement the reasonable adjustment yourself and then go to compliance. It's got to go through compliance first. Paul, you've asked if a student without a disability gets a question wrong, under what circumstance is an oral answer from the student acceptable, if at all, especially within an online environment? Paul, so you can do verbal reassessments with a student. And in fact, I know that in ARCP, what they tend to do is, let's say for argument's sake, a student gets the odd question here or there wrong. Instead of making the person go through through submitting a written assessment, they will actually just give the student the opportunity of doing a verbal reassessment, so you can do that. However, the point is that it's got to be done at reassessment time. It can't be done within the assessment process. So just to clarify, we've got the assessment process, and during the assessment process, there's a question that I as an online student got incorrect. The assessment at first instance, or the answer, my answer at first instance must be marked as incorrect, and then during reassessment, I can then, or if I then have the opportunity to do it verbally, that's fine. However, your verbal reassessments need to be recorded. Now, in an online environment, that's fairly easy, and I know certainly what ARCP does is all verbal reassessments are recorded, and the recording itself is then stored on the student file just as the written assessment outcomes are stored. Does that help, Paul? Chloe, you've asked, can you write in a reasonable adjustment? Can you write in a reasonable adjustment, spend extra time explaining the questions to the student? So, Chloe, I'm going to just reread your question. You've asked, can you write in a reasonable adjustment to spend extra time explaining the question to the student? And can you do this without compliance validating? Yes. Yes, you can, but spending extra time explaining something to the student, that isn't really a reasonable adjustment. Remember, reasonable adjustment, Chloe, comes in when a student will have difficulty completing the assessment activities without additional assistance. So reasonable adjustment isn't needing to explain the assessment requirements to somebody 2 or 3 times. Reasonable adjustment is literally a case of the person with their difficulties, be they mental, be they physical, or whatever, cannot complete the assessment without an adjustment being made. And if they were to do so, they would be disadvantaged. Does that make sense, Chloe? I hope so. Isma, you've asked, RTOs have reassessment policies in place. Isma, I'm not 100% sure on what your question is, but Usman, you've also asked that if in an online environment a particular answer is incorrect, can the assessor have a verbal answer taken and then close the matter? Yes, but doing a verbal reassessment with somebody is not reasonable adjustment. It is simply doing a reassessment with that student. Guys, remember that reasonable adjustment, I'm sorry for repeating this, but reasonable adjustment is all about having an assessment methodology in place for a student that has a disability or a difficulty of some kind, and making reasonable accommodations for them so that they are not disadvantaged. So for argument's sake, I remember when I was at law school, the uni had a distance student, and I remember in a number of our lectures where he would actually join us virtually. And I remember this guy, I don't know his name, but I remember this guy being in a wheelchair. I remember him having headsets of some kind on. I actually think that he might have been a paraplegic or something, because I remember that as he spoke, his words were actually being teletyped onto a screen. So if you have a person, for argument's sake, who is a paraplegic, who's unable to write or anything like that, you may have communication software in place where he can actually speak and his words are teletyped onto a screen or something like that. But doing a verbal reassessment is not a reasonable adjustment. It's simply a verbal reassessment. Arsenal, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. How do we record proof of that student needing reasonable adjustment? I guess it all depends on the type of their reasonable adjustment. I know that at university, if a uni has a student that has mental health problems and they then need to ask the uni to give them extra time during an exam period, that the uni would actually ask for a doctor's certificate, for a medical certificate. If a student does come and if they do need an RA for any reason, I don't believe it is unreasonable for the RTO to say, well, okay, you've said you need an RA for this reason. We're happy to accommodate that. We just need medical evidence to back it up for record keeping purposes. Falguni, you've asked, is reasonable adjustment only for disabled students, or are there scenarios for reasonable adjustments for students without a disability? Falguni, I can't see any reason why you would need a reasonable adjustment for somebody who doesn't have a special need. Because remember, a reasonable adjustment, the purpose of a reasonable adjustment is so that people with disabilities or other challenges can still undergo the assessment process as other students would without being disadvantaged. So maybe if you can think, Falguni, of an example where you think an RA might be relevant, whereas a person doesn't have a disability, throw it in the chat box and let's see if we can speak to that more specifically. Dominique, you've asked, what about email submission from students as adjustment to a written submission? Isn't an email submission a written submission? I'm not quite sure. Marlene, you've asked, okay, more a statement of understanding than a question. RA should be applied strategically, that the student requiring the RA is no more. Oh, guys, I love this. And Marlene, I'm going to just read this out very, 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 very slowly and very clearly. Guys, Marlene has just, I love what you've written there. Reasonable adjustment should be applied strategically so that the student requiring the reasonable adjustment is not more or less advantaged than a student who does not require a reasonable adjustment. The assessment can then be a reliable format or a strategy of assessment. Marlene, I love how you've said that. You've said it far better than I. Thank you for that. And guys, yeah, it's Marlene has just hit the nail on the head. Daniel, you've asked, is reasonable adjustment only students can raise about themselves, or can or should the RTO implement them upon enrollment based on their own interpretation? Whoo, Daniel, how does the RTO interpret upon enrollment that a student is going to need a reasonable adjustment? I'm a huge believer that, and at least the way that I implement or that I interpret the definition of a reasonable adjustment, it should be a case of the student coming and saying, look, you know, I'm going to have these difficulties and I would need the RTO's assistance when it comes to assessment time. Because if we just simply go and interpret on our own bat that a person needs an RA, what happens if they don't? And what happens if what we've said or done, because we've interpreted their needs, leads to or is offensive to the person or comes across as discriminatory? So I would avoid that one with a 10-foot barge pole. Falguni, you've said reasonable adjustment. For example, if a student can't do group assignments with cohort, can we allow them to do the assignment with people out of the cohort? Falguni, I'm not quite sure where your question is coming from. I'd need a bit more clarification, but it does remind me many years ago when I was a trainer and assessor, I was delivering the diploma of management. And I know that I had a student who got incredibly anxious every single time that she had to speak in front of a group of people. And this affected her ability to do presentations. I remember at the time having a chat to our compliance team, because as a trainer and assessor and as a person that's been working with a student, I was like, you know, I know that she knows the work. However, you know, she physically freezes up with anxiety when she needs to speak publicly. And I remember the compliance manager coming back at the time, and them and I sat down with the units of competency in the qualification that she was undertaking, and being able to make a presentation to a group of people was actually a requirement of the unit of competency. And we then had to make a decision. We could not make an RA in that case, and we could not allow her not to make a presentation, but still to obtain or still to pass the unit, because she actually could not make a presentation in front of other people, and therefore she couldn't meet the requirements of that unit of competency. Does that make sense? Having said that, that probably should have been picked up at enrollment stage. I don't believe it was, but it was many years ago. But yeah, look, you will get certain instances where an RA is just not practical or just not an option. And that is another reason why I say you've got to go back to compliance. Because once again, take the student I'm speaking about, with her anxiety or with it causing her anxiety to actually need to talk in front of other people, given that she was doing a management course, and given that in management we do need to make presentations, and given that there was a unit, or that unit, and I think it might have been one or two other units, specifically required her to do a presentation, how do you make a reasonable adjustment for something like that? Does that make sense, guys? Awesome. I'm getting a lot of thumbs up. Guys, there's not a lot of questions. So what I'm going to, or there's no other new questions. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to quickly tell you guys about the validator certification program, and then I'm going to come back and check if there are more questions. So let me just do this and this. So ARCP has released the RTO Validator Certification Program. And guys, what we've done is, after consultation with so many RTOs, RTOs came back and it was very, very clear that there is an absolute need within the vet sector for validators that are really, really good at what they're doing, validators that have the skills, the experience, and the knack of actually being able to produce solid validation outcomes, and that have the actually validators that have the expertise for validation. So what we've done is ARCP has taken the 3 units of the compliance skill set, which is AUD 412, AUD 514, AUD 515, and we have we've packaged them together. We have written a program focused specifically on RTO validation, and through that, and we've also included in that module 1 of the RTO standards unpacked, which in module 1 of the RTO standards unpacked, we've unpacked every single clause of the RTO standards. We go through what the clause means, how the clause should be interpreted, and how it should be implemented or applied. We've taken those 3 units from the compliance skill set, and like I said, we've contextualized everything to RTO validations, and we've also combined that with a two-day face-to-face validation workshop. Excuse me. Sorry guys, just give me 1 second. And my apologies. We've taken that and we've combined it with a 2-day face-to-face validation workshop, where I'll be running these workshops, and during those 2 days, I'm going to teach you guys how to do validations at the level that we do when we do tribunal work. For all intents and all things being equal, at the end of this course, for those of you that have completed the course, you should have the skills and the knowledge to be able to validate to such precision that if the outcomes of your validation, or if your validation findings are implemented by the RTO, that they should be ASPR audit safe. Now, the cost of the program is, my apologies, it's not $1,800, it's $1,850, and that includes, like I said, the module 1 of the RTO standards unpacked. It includes the 3 units of competency, as well as the 2-day intense validation workshop. If you do the full program, including attending the validation workshop, you will get a statement of attainment for the 3 BSB units. You'll also get a statement of attendance, of completion for the RTO standards unpacked module 1, and you'll get a statement of attendance for the validation workshop. You'll also receive accreditation from ARCP as a certified RTO validator. We will be running these workshops in all of the major cities, and the beauty of the program is that, let's say for argument's sake, you enroll in the program, the next validation workshop in your city closest to you is next month you can't make it, you can always come to a later workshop. If you decide not to attend the workshop, you will still receive a statement of attainment for the units that you've completed. And obviously, if you've completed the RTO Standards Unpacked Module 1, you'll also get a certificate of completion for that. If you want more details, please email the guys at info@complianceinstitute.edu.au and we'll give you more info. And as I mentioned earlier on, in certain states, if you are over the age of 40 and if you do want to do any accredited learning in the compliance sphere, you may be eligible for funding. So, yeah, if you are over at the age of 40, if you are looking at doing some further compliance learning, get hold of the ARCP team and they'll work through with you and see if you might be eligible for funding. I'm quickly going to have a look to see at other questions that came up. Marlene's made another. She's given us an excellent example of where reasonable adjustment may be around cultural ethos, where it prevents a male speaking directly to a group of females or vice versa. Can the reasonable adjustment be made that the males can present to a male cohort only? Marlene, that's a difficult one because let's say, for argument's sake, let's go back to the example that I used earlier on about that student that did the diploma of management. If we are going to deem a student competent in the requirement of a unit of competency, then if a person goes, culturally, I am forbidden to make a presentation to somebody of the opposite gender, if we do a reasonable adjustment on that, how do we apply that in a real life professional situation where we are giving somebody a statement of attainment, or we're giving somebody a qualification that says that they are completely competent in this qualification. However, they could only make presentations to certain groups. Marlene, I don't know. It's something that I need to think about. I must say it's something that I have not come across in almost 2 decades in the vet sector. I do know that culturally there are certain instances where male-female interaction is limited, such as where males might not shake hands with a female, or where a male might not address a female without another male accompanying the female. I've not come across a culture where males are prohibited from speaking to females or vice versa. So like I said, it's something, I'm sorry, I don't have the answer. It's something that might be worth exploring. Last question, Dominique, you've asked, can an email response from a student be acceptable for an unsatisfactory original answer, or must it be a direct assessment entry from the student? Dominique, if a student sends you an email as an answer, how do you know that is their work? How do you know that that student actually did that answer themselves, and how do you know that is authentically their own work? And if you can't establish that, then how do you as the assessor sign off that you are satisfied that it was their own work? I guess an email response would be acceptable as long as there's a statement from the learner where they are declaring that the work is their own work. But when it comes to email responses, etc., it's, like I said, the problem of authenticity is always present. And to give you an idea, when in ARCP, once again, because they are an online college, and because the entire learning journey is online, when anybody submits an assessment, there's actually a declaration that the student makes to say that their assessment is their own work. And where ARCP um, has had instances of plagiarism detected, they've actually been able to go back to the student and say, hey, by the way, we've picked up that this work that you submitted is not your own work, and you made a statement to say it is your own work, so what's up? Does that make sense? Guys, thank you so much for joining me today. As always, it was an absolute pleasure spending the time with you. I absolutely love my webinar Fridays. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you guys these last 3 months, and I'm really looking forward to spending more time with you guys next year. As I said, the webinars will continue as of Feb next year, and we will be sending everybody details of the webinars coming. So have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful year-end break. For those of you that celebrate Christmas, have a fantastic Christmas and New Year. For those of you that don't celebrate Christmas, well, have a really good time all the same. Thank you so much and take care. Bye-bye.